Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Right. So you can make those plans. Out he went and you stayed, huh? Okay. Yeah, he seems to be excited when he gets here, so I'm excited too. Yeah. Yeah, it'll be. Mm, right. Oh no. Hmm. Yeah. 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 Right. It's usually the case. No, I listen. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Well, I need a safety man around me, believe me. Okay. Chapter 17. Um, we're getting now to the where we bring to the destruction. Yeah, the destruction of Babylon. This is the precursor for that. So we'll just look ahead a little bit. Chapter 18 and 19 deal really uh, directly with that, and then but this chapter describes the great prostitute and the beast, their relationship with one another, and gives a uh, precursor to what's about to happen to her. So verse 1 says, Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and spoke to me. Come, he said, I will show you the condemnation and punishment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed sexual immorality, and the earth's inhabitants got drunk with the wine of her immorality. So there's some discussion about uh, verse 2. I just want us to look at it real quick. Let me see if I can find my note. Um, it's a cognate noun for the verb translated sexual immorality earlier in the verse, but here the qualifier sexual has not been repeated for stylistic reasons. So the idea, once again, that we carry all the way back to the Garden of Eden and God's purposes for the way that He created man and woman and their sexual union together. And here we find that that entire intention by God is yet again uh, been so misused and so misshaped by the deceiver that it has become horrendous in his sight. That there's just uh, it's it's a it's a mark upon uh, the entire presentation of evil in the world that God cannot overlook. And it is because, wrapped up in Genesis 2, there is a portion of his image that we share through our sexuality. And it is so easily abused and so easily misconstrued and so easily misrepresented that it becomes a marring of the flesh that over time destroys any opportunity of God coming through. Our whole culture is sexualized at every degree, and it's been that way now for 50 years probably, and we've become so desensitized to it, and we will continue to become desensitized to it, so that there are things that occur in a legal fashion in other countries that we think right now we just couldn't believe that ever happened here. But it'll eventually happen here because we become so desensitized to that. And that's another portion of this is the desensitization to our sexuality and what it is and what it was created for allows us to no longer see ourselves for who we are. And so we become, you've heard people say, it's a terrible thing to objectify a woman sexually and all those things. We begin to objectify our very selves that way. So it's the only way that we see ourselves. And so the image of God, we're to be image bearers of God. If that's all that we see and that's all that we want to be, then it becomes the fullness of our identity. Now, that could be anything in our life that causes us to replace the godly identity for something else. But our sexual identity has everything to do with how we were created. And I think that that's still important.
Well, I never even thought of it was more, and all of that sexual identity is on us permanently.
Yeah, yeah.
For all the other things, like to be these idolatry, idols out here, that we should find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's why it continues to come up, and now through even to chapter 21, we hear about it. So he carried me away in the spirit. He's in one of these ecstatic trances again, to the wilderness, and there I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. So we've already met this beast once, and now we see a contrast. Before, it was the woman who was giving birth to the child that was carried off into the wilderness, and she was cared for. Now we have the great prostitute that is on the beast, and she's in the wilderness, and this is not for any reason of subsistence and care. This is a way for her to where now the wilderness becomes identified as we properly understand it. This is a place of death and destruction, chaos, darkness, and here we find no rescue left from God. All that is this this image of really what is evil. Now the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet clothing, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. So she represents what? She represents power, royalty, wealth, all the things that that the world, as a means of the world that rejects God, that she represents all the things that those people run to in order to try to find meaning, security, purpose in their life. She held in her hand a golden cup filled with detestable things and unclean things from her sexual immorality. So again, she's feasting on everything that's really an abomination to God and his creation. On her forehead was written a name, a mystery: Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of detestable things of the earth. So we got to look at that a little bit. Some translations consider the word mysterion or mystery a part of the name written or mystery Babylon the Great, but the gender of both onoma, which is the name, and mysterion are neuter, while the gender of Babylon is feminine, so they would not go together. This strongly suggests that mysterion should be understood as an appositive to the name. So it is a name, but it is a mysterious name. We don't know the name. There's another identification here uh, that leaves us not knowing the fullness of it. But what we do know is this: that on her forehead is Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the detestable things of the earth. So Babylon the Great, we've already uh, discovered, uh, is synonymous with Rome. And so Rome is the great center of persecution against Christ. And Rome comes to represent all power and authority that chooses to resist Christ, his teachings, his people, all those sorts of things. So that we're not left with a historical representation that he's talking about here. John has seen something that is timeless
Yeah, anything
until
that falls.
anything that falls under that.
And you know what my mind went, that it says written on her forehead. I mean, I know when we back on the 666 or whatever, I mean, the forehead, what's written on our forehead? That it's the opposite.
Right, the opposite.
Yes.
So there's clean delineation. There's no middle name.
Yeah.
We've got it. We're either one or the other. And later he talks about ones whose name was written in the book of life before the world. And John's not even looking for determinism, and neither is God. He's just saying that there's some things about this that are settled ahead of time. Those that are righteous and are of God are identified in a way, and those that are sinful and adulterous to him are identified in another way. And so we don't need to say, well, through this, oh yeah, God's already determined, so it really doesn't matter. What John is showing us is that there is an identification that God has recognized since before the foundation of the world. You can't make what is unrighteous righteous, and you can't make what is righteous unrighteous, because it is a clear, distinct identity and reality, so to speak. So at the time that John was writing this, there was a Roman coin. On one side was a picture of the Caesar of the day, and on the other side was a picture of a woman, and she was sitting on 7 hills. Okay, so 7 hills would be Rome. It's built on 7 hills, and so the woman represents Rome. And in this picture, there's waves at her feet, and you can see that they're lapping at her feet. And then next to her is Lupa. Lupa, if you know the folklore about Rome, Lupa was the wolf that nursed Romulus and Remus, and Remus is the mythical founders of Rome.
All that, yeah, mythology stuff, all those gods,
Yeah,
Zeus and all that we've learned.
yeah.
Yeah, comes from Rome.
But the founding of Rome was possible because the she wolf named Lupa. Well, Lupa is also a term meant for prostitute in Latin. So John and God,
Yeah, so
they take the very contemporary use of a coin that is very prevalent, and that coin describes exactly what John is portraying here as a way for us to understand. Now, they certainly wouldn't have thought of Rome as being some uh, prostitute, because they weren't thinking about Rome as being subservient to a heavenly God, because who was God? Caesar was God. Um, So I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of those who testified to Jesus, and I was greatly astounded when I saw her. So here she is, the thing that brings her great pleasure, that is a sort of uh, almost an aphrodisiac for her her evil, is the blood of the martyrs and those that follow Jesus. Okay, so that's the way that John is describing this through his vision, and he's astounded that this can even be true, even with all that he's seen already. How can it be this? Yeah. But the angel said to me in verse 7, "Why are you astounded? I will interpret for you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with the 7 heads and the 10 horns that carries her." Okay, the beast you saw was and is not, but is about to come from the abyss and then go to destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, all those whose names have not been written in the book of life since the foundation of the world, will be astounded when they see that the beast was and is not, but is to come. So that language resembles what? It resembles the way we describe Jesus, who was and is to come. So uh, we have here language that helps us parallel the two. We have Jesus, who was and is to come, but we have this evil. Okay, that was uh, the beast was, but he had. Remember when we first see the beast, he's got a head that has a wound. Okay, but yet he lives. So he was and he is, because the evil that John's day is experiencing is alive and well, and he knows it is evil. And it is also an evil that will continue until there is the final day of destruction, which we're fast approaching in the letter. So what does John gather from that? Okay, this evil has been here, still here, and it's going to be here. But we identify it as such so that we understand what happens to it later. The beast you saw, the beast you saw was and is not, but is about to come up from the abyss and then go to destruction. The inhabitants of all the earth, all those whose names have not been written in the book of life since the foundation of the world, will be astounded when they see that the beast was and is not, but is yet to come. This requires a mind that has wisdom. So he's helping him understand this is a thing that there's no formula, there's no way to predict any of this. This is a way of understanding the world as it is, and how these underlying hidden structures of the world are actually have great influence behind them. This is going on while God is doing what? He's fighting our battles, because we can't. We live in this spiritual reality, and it invades our physical life, and yet we are unable to fight those battles without the one who does battle for us, and that's God. The 7 heads are 7 mountains, which would represent Rome. The mountains the woman sits on. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, one is, and the other has not yet come. But whenever he does come, he must remain for only a brief time. I want to look at mouses here, because it clears some things up for me. Since the 7 heads of the beast are also the 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen, one is and one is not yet come. The simplest answer would be that the angel is referring to a series of Roman emperors, but he doesn't fall into that, because there's too many ways to calculate those 5. If you start with Augustus, you get to this point in history too early. If you start with Julius Caesar, then there's more than 5. So um, he doesn't buy into that way of dealing with it.
Does this line up with Nebuchadnezzar's dream?
Some.
Another tiny, but it's in 5, I'm thinking 5
Well,
components, even though, the gold, the steel,
yeah.
I don't know.
Well, he doesn't address it that way here, but he does say that the best he comes to the understanding of this. There is an evil that is we begin with the identification of it in Daniel chapter 7 with Antiochus Epiphanes, where he becomes the first real.
And he's the one who sacrificed people.
Yeah, he went into the temple and he sacrificed. Okay, yeah. And so what Dr. Mouse does is he takes that this evil, we see it manifested in the lives of individuals throughout time. And the one that has not yet shown itself, he's saying, that is the one that is coming, that will manifest in the flesh this evil, as did Antiochus Epiphanes. So what is he describing there? What we often describe as the Antichrist. Okay. So the one that is yet to come, but only for a short time, would be the Antichrist. And that's the way that John probably viewed it, because there was really no way to count and make it work.
Yeah.
But when you look at it like eons, where at this stage this happened, and you can go back and identify how this evil is just marching through history. Yeah, just marching through history with us. And there's going to be a time that comes where the final king is going to manifest again, but only for a very short time. And that's what is normally identified as the Antichrist. So the numbers in all, 10 being a number that represents completeness, the number 7 there representing the 7, all that. Numerically, it doesn't all work out, so it must be symbolic. And Landry asks this question all the time: how do you know when it's symbolic, and how do you know when it's being literal? And the last time we were together and he asked that question, I did a little research on, just studying apocalyptic literature. And the suggestion is that if you look at a number and it works literally, it's probably what it's talking about. But if you come across a number and you just can't make it work, it makes sense numerically, then it must be symbolic, and then you got to try to figure out what the symbol is. So it leaves us with work to do almost every time you come across it in this letter.
I think it keeps us curious, or keeps us wanting
Yeah.
to constantly seek him.
Yeah.
So that there'll be things that, because we're not, the half hasn't been told, we're not going to know the other half till we get there, and then we have all of eternity.
Yeah.
To finish
Yeah.
trying to figure
And well, and how much of it won't matter? There'll be so much more that'll be revealed to us that. Yeah. Yeah, and then we get on to the rest of the story. Okay. The beast that was and is not is himself an 8th king, and yet is one of the 7 and is going to destruction. So that's the 8th king, the one that we've just been discussing about being the Antichrist. The 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings and have not yet received the kingdom, but will receive ruling authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. So what he's talking about here is, there's a lot of discussion about the 10 kings and there being minor Caesars in between the major ones, because, man, there was a period of time there where, like, every 6 months, some Caesar was being killed and some wannabe was taking their place. Or it could have been the governors that were ruling in these provinces that were. Well, none of that works for Dr. Mounce, especially. His thinking is that the 10 kings represent the culmination of wealth and power that want to receive from the beast their wealth and power. They want to identify with it.
That makes more sense.
It does to me too. And then that
the 1 hour is going to just be brief.
It's going to be brief. Yeah.
Doesn't matter who they think they are, what they think they're going to accomplish. They lose.
They lose. And so you could really say, okay, um, so let's say that the Antichrist finds his seat of power um, in the great city or Babylon or whatever you decide that what city would represent that or what sort of reality would represent that. And the great prostitutes there on the beast, and everybody lends their power to that power. So people begin to oppose people that had not readily opposed Christ and his people and his teachings have now joined forces. And so that there's this building of of resistance against the gospel and against Christ and persecution.
Paul guy, he's falling right in line with this.
Yeah.
It's like, did you study this part of the scriptures there, Mr. PhD study?
So yeah, so we look at this and we think, well, this could happen at any time. We've seen it at other times. But the key, and this is something that he points out that I've never really studied this, I guess, in a practical sense. I've always studied it in an academic sense, trying to make sense of it. But Dr. Mouse was saying that this is the kind of thing that can happen when when whole nations decide that they don't have nothing to do with Christianity any longer. Well, probably today more than any time in our history. We would think not, because Russia fell and there's Christianity in Russia. But there's a lot of persecution of believers today that has never existed before, even when Russia was an occupying force of Eastern Europe. So there is kind of a building. You kind of see it in our lifetime, but then you can't say it's the final building, maybe. But there's definitely an air of we don't need Christianity anymore.
Right. If you follow Tony Perkins, he's bringing out persecution every
Oh,
day that's happening right here. And the
yeah.
news isn't going to tell us about it.
No.
Yeah, but it's happening. And it's happening right here.
Yeah. So, um, so it's something to consider. Anyway, 10 horns, 10 kings. Let's see what Dr. Hahn says about that. I'm sorry I don't have these notes printed, but I couldn't get them to print. I'm just. Uh, yeah, he doesn't address it much. Um, it says these kings have a single intent, so they ought to be really easy to identify. And they will give their power and authority to the beast. They will make war with the Lamb, but the Lamb will conquer them, because he is the Lord of lords and the King of kings. And those accompanying the Lamb are the called, chosen, and faithful. Yeah, yeah. So they have a single intent, and that really is to make war against Jesus. Um,
He's going to just speak it and it's going to be.
yeah. So we have to kind of know what that is. If that's their singular intent, how do they bring that about? How does that happen? And we know in some countries, we know how it happens. You have governments that take over and they're decidedly atheist, and so they quelch any belief in Jesus. There's some other places that go the way like I described this morning, where organic secularism or godlessness is the way out of this treachery of Christianity. And so you may have a state that encourages the organic nature of that, makes it less appealing to believe and more appealing to depend upon and find identity in something else. So that could be a way in which one of the 10 kings, quote unquote, um, would go about making war against the Lamb. Um, Inside the church, we talked about that this morning, how controversies that tend to distract us from what Christ has really commanded us to do and from being the people that he is creating us to be. Those type of controversies can begin to undermine uh, the very faith in which they find themselves operating, and bring about, at best, a misrepresentation of Jesus in the world. All of those things working together can be pretty powerful. And there's probably others I can't even think of. But the Lamb will conquer them. He doesn't even, it's like, but the Lamb will conquer them. And, yeah. And the reason why that he says the Lamb will conquer is because he's the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. There's none higher. There's none more powerful. There's none greater. There's none with greater wisdom.
When he said, "Stone, run away,"
yeah,
it was done.
Yeah.
When he walked out of that grave,
that was it. That was it.
It was finished. It was finished at the cross, but it was done at the resurrection.
Yeah. Yeah, all of this other stuff that's playing out is a thrashing about. I think it's N.T. Wright that describes it that way. It's a very English way of saying it, so I'm assuming it is. But he says it's like the world is thrashing about now.
That's how I see what's happening with us in America, with kids, and with everybody's just.
It's just a thrashing about.
It's throwing a fit. To me, it's just a throwing a fit. I'm not giving my way. They're calling it cancel culture, or whatever all the names they want to give it, but everybody's just throwing down. Because if you're going to accept me. I'm a boy that wants to be a girl, whether you like it or not. And if I want to bring home I'm a good daughter, but I'm going to bring home my girlfriend, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. Because who I am is right. That's the thinking. How can I be wrong about any of those things? Well, we're constantly wrong about who we are. We're constantly wrong about who we are to other people. We sometimes think that we are good for other people when we're not, and vice versa. And we're constantly in that state of flux in our life that really requires us to find a presence in our life that knows better. And we live in a world that knows everything. I mean, we do. We live. People believe they know everything.
Well, that I just get on the phone because Google says it, and I can find the answer out right now, whether I know it or not.
And believe what they see.
No matter what they enter, no matter what pops up.
Yeah.
Because Google says it's right.
Yeah.
I want to say, I'm an idiot, but I don't say that.
No. Like, you gotta love them anyway. And that really is the adventure of it. Well, I don't want to get hung up on that too much. At the end of verse 14, he says, "Those accompanying the Lamb are the called, the chosen, and the faithful." So some people would say, okay, called and chosen, isn't that the same thing? And really, there is a distinction there. They're listed as three different categories, let's say. And they're not talking about one person possessing all those things. He's calling them three different things, I think is what hold on, let me make sure. No. It is describing an individual as called, chosen, and faithful. There'll be many of them. Is that the way? Verse 14.
Mine's 14, and it's saying, see, trying to see where it's so small, and my eyes are getting so old. It says, mine is saying, see chapter 2, verse 10, and then Luke 18:7.
I'm going to go to Luke. Luke 18.
Yeah, 18:7, and then 2:10. But mine is saying about the called. All I have is a C. But called, chosen, faithful.
So Luke 18:7 is the persistent widow. He's talking about faithfulness, I'm sure.
Yeah, and then 10 is do not fear that you are about to suffer. Oh, the devil got to close one of those commitments. I don't get that.
So what those cross references are doing is describing for us the qualities of a person that is called, chosen, and faithful. That they're persistent in their prayer to God, meaning persistent in their reliance upon God, knowing that everything comes from God, and they're not going to achieve anything in this life without it. So that would be the same thing. People that accompany the Lamb are those who are faithful to Him, who have responded to His call upon their life, who are chosen and have chosen um, a life with Him. Again, I think the point is there's no middle ground for folks. You're either with Him or against Him, like they used to say. And this is how you know that you're with Him. So some of what we were talking about this morning in our sermon was that there's a point at which our dedication to Jesus defines everything else that follows. If we really don't have that kind of dedication, what Paul was really saying to Timothy was, you're not going to be able to do any of the rest of this stuff, but you are dedicated.
And do you think our country has gone from 75% to 47% because they're not dedicated?
There's not much dedication. You know, we've convinced ourselves that we're pretty important people, that we can kind of live things the way we want to live them, and
We can figure it out on our own.
yeah, and for some they would say, well, the church really hasn't done that much for humanity. You know that.
Sometimes we get mad at the church when we tell them, there comes a point you got to pick up your bootstraps and come join us.
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
And that's an imposition for some. That's not the kind of faith that they signed up for. They just want to be saved. And
Rescue me from this problem I have. Like you said
yeah.
today, they're reacting in this one
See, if
episode instead of a whole life.
yeah, if Jesus had just wanted to save people, then He would have never said to Peter what He said.
Yeah. Feed my sheep.
You know, well, no, when in the verse I read this morning where He says, Peter, Peter, pay attention. Satan has requested to sift you like wheat.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I've heard say that if he wanted to save us, we would all drop dead the moment we accepted Him as Christ.
Yeah.
Why
So
would
he wouldn't have had to say any of that to Peter. You believe in me? It doesn't really matter what happens after that. It doesn't matter that you come back and you strengthen your brothers, and none of the things are going to happen. It doesn't even really matter that you deny me and you come back from that and you're stronger than ever. See, that's where people miss the whole idea behind the life with Christ, that we become more. We are to become more than what we were, because now our life is not the one, there's not only the life that God created us.
we skip over the we're the joint heirs and the suffering.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to read that.
No, we'll cherry pick and proof text the verses about, you have not because you ask not. And, your problem is you need to send me $100 so I can pray for you if you're not going to pray for you, and create this whole prosperity thing that goes on. And really, those people will never talk about you perfected through sufferings as Christ was perfected through His sufferings.
It doesn't draw television viewers and people into the message.
Yeah. Yeah.
But speaking of that, I don't know if you saw Roger Guido whisper when he said that it's about prosperity. I watched Hallmark, and it just so happened on Golden Girls, because that's usually coming on right after my Hallmark movies. And Sophia and Richie diagnosing evidence, and Peter, whatever, met her, and something about, he said, oh, I gotta go, there's a televangelist that's arrived. And she goes, why is that big deal? That's never happened up here.
That's funny.
When you said that this morning, I said, that kind of went along with that joke you saw. They've never been up here before.
Then the angel said to me, verse 15, the waters you saw where the prostitute is seated are all peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages, meaning that the following that she has is vast and diverse.
Seeds have always represented people a lot of other places.
Yes, yeah. The 10 horns that you saw in the beast, these will hate the prostitute and make her desolate and naked. They will consume her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put into their minds to carry out his purpose by making a decision to give their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. Now that's a loaded. How does that happen? And I want us to look.
Yeah, how God uses even the evil to accomplish his work.
Yes. Yeah. And who better knows? There's a passage in Ezekiel chapter 23 that describes the same thing. The nations and the seated emperor will turn on Rome and destroy her. Um, the legend at the time was Nero was going to come back to life, and he was going to invade Rome with the Parthians and take control again. But evil turns on itself and devours itself, um, and yet still has enough to attack the Lamb when the time comes. So something that we learn in this, and boy, we should be paying attention as the church. Evil will always turn on itself and devour itself. There is nothing about evil that is a respecter of anything, evil or good. And so it always brings to its own destruction. And there's some, we can gain some confidence in that, knowing that this is what happens, so that there's two fronts upon which evil finds its demise, and one is with itself, and the other is with the Lamb. So there's a destruction, and then there is a totality of destruction, and that's what's described here. They devour themselves now, but wait until next chapter when it all begins to come apart. And here we see that the prostitute's destroyed by its own self. The one that has led them astray ultimately is the one that is rather graphically torn to pieces. Um, as for the woman you saw, she is the great city that has sovereignty over the kings of the earth. So, the kings of the earth devour the prostitute, but there's still the woman who's the great city, Babylon, and she still has control. So she represents what? Power, wealth. Yeah. Now, let's see, verse 18. I'm going to read a little bit out of here. It says, for the fourth time in this chapter, the angel identifies and interprets a figure in a vision. The woman is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. For John, the city is Rome. She's a wicked seducer whose pernicious influence has permeated the whole Mediterranean world. Yet Babylon the Great, source of universal harlotry and abomination, is more than first century Rome. Every great center of power that has prostituted its wealth and influence restores to life the spirit of ancient Babylon. Well, he is speaking to modern day power. John's words extend beyond his immediate setting in history and sketch the portrait of an eschatological Babylon, which will provide the social, religious, and political base for the last attempt of Antichrist to establish his kingdom. That, let's see, I want to make sure we get. Da, 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 da. So the thing that seems a bit inconsistent is that uh, we read about the great prostitute all the way through this, and we get to the point where the great city is described as a woman too, and we have to understand it's not the same thing. And I was looking for an explanation, but he doesn't give really one. that provides us with an explanation. So the great power structures of the world today that we might identify as those that are opposing Christ and are not just opposing Christ, but are purporting, encouraging this life of evil, who would we identify? I'll say it on video. The Chinese are one.
Yeah, I'm talking about today. Yeah,
Yeah. Committing genocide against whole demographics of people, regardless of who they are.
Hitler today,
It would have been Hitler.
why not in America today Planned Parenthood?
Well, yeah. So we can look at the things that the policies of governments and say that's definitely opposing Christ, the Spirit of Christ, His teachings, those sorts of things, and not be wrong in identifying as such. May not be that we may jump too far ahead and say that, oh yeah, because of this is the end and the end is coming. Because I tend to believe that every generation has had times.
But they've all thought this is the end.
Yeah.
Man, if you could have lived during the Holocaust, who would not have thought that wasn't the end?
Right. That's exactly right.
You're hiding your family and friends is what I'm thinking. You're hiding in an attic and then you're all killed anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think you think that's
Or in Vietnam, believing Catholics was the predominant, and they, when we pulled out, they were almost annihilated. That would have been it for them. They would have understood. So we have to be very careful, is my point, in trying to identify our current events with what John is stating here. But what we are able to say in this, that when we recognize that happening, that even in ways like Planned Parenthood, some other things, other policies, and when we see that happening, we can, I believe, quite safely be able to say that this is part of the battle that's going on. This is part of the structure, the battle taking place in the hidden structures of our life that sometimes creep out into the open, where we actually experience and have the ability to fight alongside against these things. Because this is what's going on all the time in the spiritual realms, as Paul describes in his letters. I think today, most believers don't want to give that a lot of thought, because it takes a lot to work through the idea that we live in this, that we actually live in a spiritual world, and the reality that we are a part of, it breaks in and out of that.
The one good thing I think about the Left Behind movies and stuff is how it shows immediately.
Yeah. Yeah.
That our sights going to be,
and it's all right here.
It's going to become sight.
Yeah.
That would be the only one good thing. We Americans who need to be entertained, we can watch those
Oh gosh.
kind of movies and at least give us, because it is awesome, fascinating how you read this, but how is it going to come back?
Right. And when we get to the rest of it, 18, and we'll probably do 18 and 19 together next week, because they really should be, I think, taken together. And then we'll be almost done. We'll move on to our next thing, which is my questions, which I haven't gotten any yet. I guess I gotta make a little video. I'm taking questions. To start my next Sunday night thing is going to be answering people's questions, and we'll do the whole thing with how then shall we now live. And
so instead of asking Jeff, it's going to be asking. Did you ever follow? Jeff Myers used to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I've
pretty bold to stand up there, but I noticed after one or two, he was taking them by email and.
Yeah, I wouldn't dare do it on the spot.
Quit taking them on the floor, because some of them are getting so
Yeah.
Okay, that's not a necessary question.
Yeah. Yeah. People they would just want to kind of outsmart you rather than
Yeah.
really there to try to get a
Just
question
study
answered.
it, yeah.
But I would rather study it anyway and give a proper
So you're
answer.
gonna open it up for people to email you or to.
Yeah, email me.
If they want to handwrite you a question or
Yeah.
whatever, you're gonna for you.
Yeah.
And so you're gonna start doing that on,
As soon as I finish this.
so will you do it just online or will you have a meeting on some nights?
No, we're going to meet here.
So,
We'll just continue like we're doing.
so it'll just be a matter of coming together with the questions?
Yeah. And I'll do one a night because I want to do the videos with Francis Schaeffer. They're a half hour long.
Oh, okay.
And I want to take time to discuss those for a period of time, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And then I'll take another 20 minutes and answer one question.
I'm just trying to figure out what to do.
Do what?
I'm just trying to figure out what the ladies are doing with you. And I mean, I'm excited that you've got something, you know, for summertime.